welcome to the Film Angle. Kris, should we just start calling this like its own series? Should we call it the Short Film Angle? Should we do that?
Yeah, the interview angle. No, let's go for the short film angle.
The Short Film Angle. This is the series in which we kind of showcase some emerging short films and interview their directors.
Yeah, and today is another great film that we're going to be talking about, Anuja, which has already been winning festivals where it pre-qualifies for the Oscars, so there's a lot of traction with this film at the moment, so really excited to talk about Anuja with director and writer Adam J. Graves today.
Yeah, the film is potentially on track to be shortlisted at the Academy Awards. So we wish it all the best luck because we did really enjoy it. That being said, it is another short film that isn't publicly available yet, but we think that doesn't take away from the experience of the interview. It's good to kind of get an insight into Adam's background, why he wanted to make the film. But obviously we do go into a little bit of behind the scenes on the film. But I think it is something that you can kind of come to without seeing the short film. But we will give you a lowdown on what the short film is about.
So the story follows Anuja, a precocious 9-year-old orphan who quits school to work alongside her sister at a local garment factory. She finds herself faced then with a choice that will determine the fate of her future and her family.
And it's probably interesting to note that this film, as opposed to the previous films we've spoken about, is actually set on the streets of Delhi in India. Although has an American writer-director, the language spoken in it is Hindi. So something a bit different today.
And hopefully Adam's going to tell us all about how he relates to this project and why it means so much to him and, why this story.
So without further ado, let's get on to our interview and welcome Adam to the podcast.
Alex and I are very excited and honored to welcome writer-director Adam J. Graves, who is a PhD philosopher turned filmmaker, here today to discuss his new Oscar-qualifying film, Anuja. Adam, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Kris, Alex, thank you so much for having me. Couldn't be happier to be here.
No, the honor is ours, Adam. It's difficult to know where to start because I think it's fair to say that you have such an extensive and interesting background as a filmmaker. Would you kindly do us the honor of introducing yourself and letting our listeners know a little bit more about you?
Interesting is one way to put it. I hope it's not boring. So I'm a professor of philosophy. That's my, day job, as it were, and just started to make films only a couple years ago, as we were coming out of the pandemic. And I have a background in South Asian studies. So I studied, ever since I was very young. I mean, I would say middle school, I was kind of obsessed with Eastern philosophy and especially Indian forms of religious traditions and early Indian Buddhism and Hinduism. And so I wound up doing my undergraduate degree in what was then called Indic studies or South Asian studies. And I traveled a lot in India, studied at the Banaras Hindu University in Varanasi, studying mostly Sanskrit literature and philosophy. And I wound up actually in Varanasi because my professor in the US, where I first attended college, the one faculty member who taught Sanskrit refused to teach an undergraduate Sanskrit. He said, no, Sanskrit is too specialized, get a degree in philosophy or something general and then come back, later. So I, told him to take a hike, but I actually took a hike. I grabbed my backpack and headed to India when I was quite young. And that was my first quarter of my first semester of college. So so spent a lot of time in India back and forth for about 5 years. I wound up doing my degree at the University of Pennsylvania, which at the time had it may still to this day have the best South Asian studies program in the US. But at that time, there were over a dozen Sanskritists at Penn, which is an unusual thing in the Western world, and is even more unusual today, unfortunately. But anyway, so that was kind of my academic beginning. Along that journey, I met my wife, Suchitra Matai, who's an artist who happens to be of South Asian descent. And I imagine we might talk more about her background when we talk about the film, since she was largely an inspiration for it. I wound up, though, doing I wrote a master's thesis on a philosopher by the name of Abhinavagupta, not a super well-known philosopher outside of South Asia, but he's known as a Kashmir Shaivite who worked in this area of philosophy known as, or this kind of school known as Tantrism, which is today the word Tantra has kind of been usurped by in popular culture and is often associated with like eroticism and things like that because of for all kinds of reasons. But Abhinavagupta's philosophy is very elevated and interesting, and I'm still profoundly inspired by his work. But also he wrote one of the earliest treatises in the South Asian tradition on aesthetics, and a really influential work on aesthetics, the theory of art. And that, I suppose you could say, has influenced to some extent my work in film. So I went on to do my PhD, actually, after writing that master's thesis in an area of philosophy known as hermeneutics, which is the theory of interpretation, a very fancy word. It might be better known in the UK than in America. My mom, for many years, thought I was doing my dissertation on a guy by the name of hermeneutics, but but anyway, so yeah, hermeneutics, just the theory of interpretation, kind of grew out of 19th century German philosophy and became an entire kind of branch or school or movement, also associated with phenomenology, which is perhaps slightly better known. And that is my area of expertise. And I've over the course of my career, I'm kind of an old man. I don't like to admit it, but I've been teaching.
Not at all.
I've taught at the university for how many years? 20, not quite 20 years. If you count my teaching days as a grad student, I suppose I've been teaching for almost 2 decades. But started using film in my classes as you might say, like a heuristic device, and increasingly as students are prone to read less and less, I found myself relying more and more on film, and honestly just falling in love with film as a medium in and of itself, but also as a vehicle for examining certain aspects of human experience that aren't quite accessible to discursive modes of analysis.
Sure. Yeah.
So philosophy often uses very abstract examples or thought experiments to get points across, or to kind of clarify some concept. And what I find is that those thought experiments are often wooden, and they're empty. They fail to kind of capture the richness, the texture of human existence. And so film and the kind of the narrative structure of film and just the nature of it as a medium, it just allows you access to aspects of human experience that in human existence that, quite frankly, those simple thought experiments never really allow you to penetrate. So instead of just using it as a merely heuristic device in like intro level courses, I started teaching a lot of upper division courses, analyzing film in detail and writing a bit about film. And along the way, it just, to be honest, it's weird. I've been obsessed with film since I was a kid too. Like I was the one kid in my block, in my neighborhood, who would bike, the 5 miles across, 4 or 5 miles across my hometown to the strip mall where the movie theater was.
Yes.
And I would, I'm sure you guys are, so this is not an unusual story among filmmakers and film critics and such. But yeah, I'd try to catch the earliest matinee at 11 or whatever, and then I would just hop from one theater to the next, kind of sneaking in and out of theaters so I could catch all the films in the theater. But so I've always been friends with filmmakers, and I always knew I wanted to make film, but it took the pandemic to kind of jostle me out of my comfort zone and and really dive in and make the plunge. So anyway, sorry, that was long-winded.
I'm going to say, Adam, I think you're qualified.
Well, yeah, it is interesting because actually my introduction to philosophy actually came through my film degree. We had a module, film and philosophy. And at first I remember, because it was, I remember the module was specifically 9 a.m. on a Monday morning. And I thought there's no way I'm going to be able to do this at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning. But in fact, it was probably the best time because my mind was in that ready mode just to be like blown by these different ideas, which like you said, like film touches on these kind of theories and aspects of of humanity, and is able to convey these messages. And like, there are films that you don't know that are kind of like these philosophical studies, but are actually kind of like really picking into some of the different ideas that we know today. So like, at what point during the pandemic were you like, okay, I love film, I love philosophy, now I want to make something, I want to tell my own stories?
Yeah, that's a good question. I, by the way, on the subject of reading philosophy or watching film and thinking about them early in the morning, I think it is the case that a lot of times our best ideas, the ones that kind of break free from the kind of mold of conventional wisdom, come to us when we're in a half asleep state. That's my wife as an artist tells me that she often has these visions that come to her as she's not fully awake, not fully asleep. And I have to say that in writing screenplays, that's when the magic happens. It's like when you're not
like lucid dreaming.
For me, I suppose, I live in California. For most screenwriters, who knows, they're probably just like, doing chewables or something, but it's
not at all.
But it's there's something about that kind of loosening up of the mind and its inhibitions and the conventional wisdom that tends to concentrate the mind. You need to kind of frustrate that in order to get at the important stuff. So yeah, film class at 9 a.m. I could do that. So getting to your question, I think we were just coming out of what we thought was the end of the pandemic. It turned out to be the first wave. The pandemic forced all of us, in the folks in my department, all of us were fairly skeptical about online learning. And we had resisted as a department teaching courses online for the most part. And then, of course, we were kind of the only holdout. Almost every other department had complete majors that you could conduct through online learning. And of course, when the pandemic happened, we were all forced online. And first off, two things I want to say. One, I've become more comfortable with it as a means. I don't think it's impossible to conduct a good class online anymore. But the other part of it is just that I did have more time on my hands because I was teaching a bunch of sections of intro to philosophy that semester. And once I'd had had it all worked out, I had all my lectures recorded. I was finishing a book that I'd been working on for over really like a decade. And as soon as I sent that off to the publishers, I was like, you know what? Now is the time. Like, why wait? I was thinking I would do this in my retirement, filmmaking, but I had just completed this big project that had gone to press. My teaching load was relatively light, at least it seemed to be the case at that time. So I thought, why don't I take some of this, pent up, energy from working on this one project and pour it into a screenplay. So I started writing a screenplay, and being, as naive as I am and certainly was, I started writing a feature film, and showed it to some friends, one of whom was a friend of a friend, a producer in Paris. The film was going to be shot in Paris. And he came back and said, well, if you do this on an exceedingly tight budget, you could probably pull it off for like $2.5 million. And I was like, what?
Wow.
What? I literally thought I was going to take like half of my salary, like a couple thousand, and just in the camera and head off to Europe and shoot this feature film. Like, I had no idea. I mean, of course I knew films have, we all know films have, hundreds of million, $100 million, $2 million, $200 million budgets. But I just thought, why can't you make a film on a scrappy, why can't I just go make a film on 20,000, whatever. And as I started looking into the reality of it, kind of piecing it together, and I realized, okay, let's start with a short film. And so, I kind of did the prudent thing. I wrote a relatively short screenplay, all of which could be shot in my living room and or the local environs in Denver, where I was living at the time. So, and that was my first film. It's called Cycle Verite. It's on Amuletto, by the way, incidentally. So if any of your listeners watch short films on Amuletto, you can find it there, Cycle Verite.
That's great. Thanks for the recommend there. Obviously, this transition into filmmaking with a few short films under your belt now. Do you see writing and directing as sort of a path you'll continue to pursue now? Like, have you left the teaching behind, or a hybrid, or?
I'm a philosopher, so it's hard to, once it's in your bones, it's hard to give that up. There is a venerable tradition of of philosopher turned filmmakers out there. People like Terrence Malick, who actually, speaking of the UK, he went to do a master's. I think he, after studying at Harvard with Stanley Cavell, the great philosopher and of aesthetics, he went to Oxford to translate a lesser known work by the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. And I think at some point, don't quote me on this, Terrence, who I've never met, but at some point he left that program to shoot film. And one of my colleagues was actually pretty decent friends with him. They were classmates at Harvard back in the 60s. You're familiar with Terrence Malick is, I'm guessing. Tree
of course,
Life.
yes. Yeah.
The Badlands.
Thin Red Line. Yeah,
Thin Red Line. He said that, there's something about philosophy. It takes a long time to kind of establish oneself as a philosopher. Immanuel Kant published the Critique of Pure Reason when he was like approaching 60. And Terrence thought, if you're a filmmaker, you just go make something and you'll know right away whether you're any good at it. That's the apocryphal story I've been told. Long story short, I don't think I'll be able to, expatiate or expel the philosopher from my bones anytime soon. But I do imagine that it will infuse itself into that. I already see that it's there. I mean, I don't think of the two things as being actually separate. I think of film as being an inherently philosophical medium, and so I hope to do both. But yeah, to answer the question, yeah, my I intend to make a feature film. That's the next thing I want to do.
You mentioned as well, on top of the philosophy, I believe you did a degree in South Asian studies. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And obviously you spent a bit of time in India yourself. I was just wondering, how did the interest in the country and the culture, how did that actually come about then? What was it that kind of made you fall in love with the culture of India?
That it's a little bit mysterious. I'm not entirely sure. The one thing I can say is that it is inherently interesting. That is to say, if you kind of catch the bug, and you spend any time kind of studying and reading about classical Indian thought and literature, one of the things you quickly discover is there's a vast tradition there. Now, of course, South Asians are obviously very aware of this fact, but oftentimes kids like myself growing up in the Midwest of America are not. But that there's a vast literature there. It actually boggles the mind how vast it is. I think there are more classical Sanskrit texts than there are Latin and Greek texts combined. So if you can just imagine that, and that's just one classical Indian language. There's also Prakriti. There's Pali. There's other classical Indian languages that have vast literatures. So I grew up in a medium-sized town in Minnesota, central Minnesota. From fairly early on, I was just really I was interested in escaping from what felt. I'm not ashamed of my cultural heritage or background or anything like that. But I had this yearning to learn more about the world beyond. And when I was in junior high, when I was probably 13 or so, I encountered the writings of a guy named Joseph Campbell, who's kind of a cult figure among some people out here in Hollywood these days. And everybody who reads him in Hollywood knows they're not serious readers of Joseph Campbell. Come on. But as a kid, I would do Joseph Campbell, movie marathons. I'd watch all of his Bill Moyers interviews and stuff like that. But anyways, I was really interested in world mythology. I'd spent some time when I was very young. When I was 17, I did this solo expedition through an area of Irian Jaya known as the Osmat, and spent time among a indigenous population that was completely disconnected from quote unquote the outside world. That experience led me to appreciate, I think, to some extent, the just how deep cultural differences can go, and how inaccessible certain conceptual systems or schemas can be. Trying to find a common language with the Osmat seemed almost impossible. India seemed almost like home. By the time I was in India, I felt like I was conversing with a tradition that wasn't that foreign from my own. There are these stories. They're kind of, there's stories of early European traders arriving on the coast of Goa, and for the first time in months of their seafaring expeditions, they could actually communicate somehow, like count with the local population, because at least the North Indian languages are part of the Indo-European language group. The South Indian languages also have Dravidian origins, a different language group. But the point is that there's actually some kind of cultural connection between what people used to call the East and the West in kind of old colonial terminology. So I just felt somehow at home within that philosophical tradition. So yeah, so that's I've just rambled and I've lost the track, lost the thread. But I think you were asking how I came to my interest, and I don't think I really did a good job of explaining how I came to.
Oh, you did a really good job, Adam.
Well, and I think as well, you showed just how fascinated and how much you have learned about the culture itself. Like you clearly have a big passion. I guess that kind of serves as to why Anuja is a film about Indian children and set in India. And I imagine that was kind of a big feat to take on in itself. For our listeners, do you want to describe Anuja a little bit? What is the short film about? And then we can kind of get into it a little bit with you.
Sure. Yeah, no, that'd be great. So the origins of the project partly come from, my interest in South Asian culture and wanting to film something there. My wife is also of South Asian descent. She was, her family traces their roots back to Gorakhpur, which is a town not far from Varanasi where I had studied. And I passed through Gorakhpur actually, incidentally, years before I met my wife. But her ancestors were brought by the British to Guyana and as indentured laborers in like the early 1900s, when the British after the British had, abolished slavery in the colonies. They went into villages and recruited poor villagers in places like northern India to come to the colonies in exchange for, the possibility of one day earning their freedom. But they effectively were slaves. I mean, they lived in the same quarters and had the same the same work schedule, whatever, as the slave population that they replaced. But after a certain number of years, and I forget the exact number, but it might have been 5, it might have been 10, they would be either given a plot of land, or they would be given safe passage back to their homes. And my wife's ancestors, at least on one side, decided to go back to India, and they discovered that the India that they had left was no longer a hospitable place for them. In kind of traditional Indian thought, there was a prohibition actually against living abroad, you might say, and crossing the oceans was considered a kind of a dangerous and also kind of problematic thing to do. So they weren't super welcomed back in their village in outside of Gorakhpur. So they wound up then making the journey all the way back to Guyana. And anyways, I only tell that story because the film, as you know, deals with issues of labor, and issues of labor are kind of woven through my wife, woven into our family's history. And so we think a lot about labor issues. And while we were coming out of the pandemic and I was finishing my first little short film, Psycho Verite, we were reading a lot about, we're doing two things. We were thinking about shooting a film in India one day. Like, God, wouldn't it be great we've been cooped up in our home in Denver. We hadn't been able to travel. Like, wouldn't it be great to go shoot somewhere? And where better than film? Let's go to India and let's make a film, as like a family project. And we were reading a lot about the supply chain issues that have now come back into the news. It seems everybody was clamoring, why can't I get my hands on these goods? And and so we started wondering why all the coverage was only on the consumer end of the supply issue. Nobody really was paying any attention to the production end. And I was thinking, like, how is this global shutdown affected or impacted families whose economic circumstances are already incredibly tenuous? So that led us to kind of doing some research into the kind of the labor market, and we were focusing actually at that point on labor in places like Delhi. And my wife came across this statistic that really shook us to the bone, which is that 1 in 10 kids globally is engaged in child labor. And that seemed like a really high number. One out of every 10 kids doesn't go to school but works instead, right? And that's 160 million kids. And, in a huge percentage of those kids are doing work that's incredibly, that's detrimental to their health, their education, their well-being, their development. And so we got in touch through kind of friends of friends, we got in touch with various nonprofit organizations. We learned more about child labor and the different sectors in which kids are working and the kind of work that they're doing and how it's impacting them. We learned that it impacts girls oftentimes more than boys because it's in certain families, it's they think they can justify more easily kind of pulling their girls out of school to work. And so oftentimes girls are kind of held back from school and they're either sent, working in a factory setting or working in the home setting. We discovered actually that a lot of factories in places like Delhi that had previously employed kids have either, have kind of outsourced their work so that now a lot of kids are doing work in the domestic space, but it's the same factory work. They've just outsourced it so that the authorities can't track them. It's harder to track.
It's a veneer. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like it's become less visible, so child labor persists, but it's less visible. It's harder to track. And along the way in our research, we became we got to know the people at the Salam Balik Trust, which is a really lovely nonprofit in Delhi. They have a branch in Mumbai as well that provides food, shelter, education to street children and working children. I should say formerly street and working children, because once they're associated with this, once they're given a home and we did a number of site visits with them and with some other nonprofits in Delhi and developed the story based on different case studies that they'd given us and of their children and their children's backgrounds. And it just kind of developed, it just kind of snowballed from there.
For me, Adam, watching the film, there's definitely like a real balancing act when you're a filmmaker. Like, he wants to tell an honest and observational story, but also hit home with the real world truths and inform the audience that this isn't just a one-off singular story, that this is actually happening to thousands of children in India every day. So it's great that the film manages to maintain a tone that I think is ultimately inspiring for kids in that situation, to see themselves mirrored as having value, something that they can offer and expand their scope in terms of bringing more value to the world and their own lives. So was it important for you to not only shed light on the issues faced by these characters, but also offer a sense of hope and possibility for any children in Anuja's shoes watching the film?
Absolutely. Thank you. Your question contains in itself the best possible answer. And that is that as we were developing the film and working with the kids that helped us make it, because I should say that a number of our creative crew members and cast members are from the home. Principally, Sajda Patan, the girl who plays the lead, as you know, is actually a girl who lives at the home now, and but about a year before we shot was living on the streets with her sister, and but also other kids who were served as kind of background actors in the factory from the home, and also Pankaj Gupta, who is a story consultant and is an acting coach now. He grew up in the Salam Balik program and is now a teacher at the Salam Balik Trust Home for Kids. So, and they just performed just over the last couple of days, they've been performing a theatrical performance in Delhi with all their kids called Two Wolves. And so anyway, and Sajda, our actress, is in that show. So I'm sad that I didn't get to see it live on stage. Yeah, but as we developed the story and we were working with these kids, we realized that those kids were like the principal audience, that more than anything, we wanted to make a film that they would actually want to watch. And that would spark conversation and also be a bit, inspiring. I will say that it is important to say, and I think you guys understand this, but as filmmakers and as artists, the first thing you want to do is create a beautiful work of art that moves its audience in a certain way and that expands. I think all great art kind of somehow expands our ability to see human reality, right? Like somehow shapes our provides another lens through which to see the world in which we all live. And so art has to that extent doesn't have to be universal, but it has to have a universal impact. It has to be universally
like you can
impactful.
Empathize with people whose cultures you wouldn't normally maybe interact with, but like that human element is the kind of thing keeping it all together. The thread.
Exactly. And you want to make something that, like we didn't set out just to make. We're really happy that this film is going to be that hopefully this film will raise. We're going to work really hard to use the film as a tool to raise awareness about child labor and try to raise funds as well for the Slambolic Trust and other nonprofits that are helping to end child labor. But it wasn't designed or ever conceived of as an infomercial for a nonprofit.
Yes, yeah.
I don't think anybody who watches it would ever think that's what it is, or that it's a public service announcement about like, oh, look at this terrible thing. It's child labor. We should all feel bad. The film is, I still believe to this day, and I think most people who watch it understands this. It's an entertaining film that kind of hopefully both entertains and inspires in the way that artwork does inspire. And that's kind of the first thing that it has to do. If your art doesn't do that, then it's not, no one's going to watch anything if it's not good. Right. So you just want, and so I feel like that was, we really, I wanted to do like, I don't love every coming of age film, but some of my favorite films are coming of age films. And they're the ones that influenced me when I was young, like when I was in, the second grade, I think Stand By Me came out. The film that's based on a Stephen King novel, but it's directed by Rob Reiner, who made so many lovely kind of like, I don't want to call them family films, but he made
Princess
so many
Bride
lovely,
and things
films in the 80s that were just like kind of like, I think for kids my age, these were iconic, works of art that like shaped our worldview. So Stand By Me is one of those movies. And I was like, I want to do something like a short film that has like the texture of Stand By Me, that brings you into a world and a group of kids go on an adventure, and it's an adventure that like adults want to slip into, because somehow in slipping into it, you also slip back into your childhood, and then you slip into the magic of childhood, and you kind of feel those feelings that you haven't since you were 12 or whatever. That's how I feel Stand By Me operates on its audience. It performs that for me every time I watch it. And I want to make something like that. It just so happened that we decided to highlight or foreground a story that features kids who are working, because that's 1 in 10 kids. So it was almost like we wanted to make a coming of age story. And if you're going to make one, every 10th coming of age story should be a story about kids who are working, like statistically speaking, right? And we realized like this is an incredibly rich world, like all the kinds of all the challenges that these kids face.
Oh, peripherally, there's a lot going on.
Yeah. Like it's like, this is not like the definitive story of child labor. Like 160 million kids, like there could literally be 160 million different stories to tell. It's such a rich world, and it's a world that we should see more often represented on screen. And so I thought, principally, let's make a movie about, let's make a coming of age story that stirs its audience in the way that, something like Stand By Me. I mean, far be it for me to claim that I could ever make something as great as that, but then foregrounding stories of these kids who are working, and then also inspired by the fact that these kids are themselves so incredibly, the kids that we met were so, they had like such a spark of life in them. And I have to say that these were kids who were, for the most part, now attending school, or living at the Slambolic Trust home, or attending at least a day center where they would go for a couple hours a day before they would go back to their homes and work with their mothers and stuff. But they were just so full of life, and they were so resilient and hopeful and joyous, and they seemed to find joy under the circumstances that they were, they find that they were in. And we wanted to capture something of that magic that we saw. Like there were so many kids who were like, wow, wouldn't it be amazing? Like if we could make a film that captured that energy, like for example, we were in South Delhi and like we visited a branch of Save the Children, and we showed up at their at like a little school. It was like basically one large room where they would do activities and stuff. And then we went with the organizers into the what we would call like a slum, effectively, where the kids live and often work. And we would meet with their mothers and stuff. We did this kind of trip where they showed us the kind of work that the kids were doing before the Save the Children branch convinced the parents to let their kid come to school for a couple of days, at least every day. And we got back to the school, the kids spontaneously decided to like put on like a dance performance. And so they had like, while we were out visiting,
whether you liked it or not.
Yeah. Well, we got back and like all of a sudden there's music playing and they're doing this choreographed dance and it was amazing. It was like they were incredibly gifted. And so we thought, gosh, if we could just capture that lightning in a bottle, that would be amazing.
Adam, I think like the midsection of the film, I think that vibrancy was captured because what also strikes me is how resilient the two girls are. The sequence where they are navigating the streets, selling Palak's bags that she's been secretly making in the factory with leftover materials. There's like a real childish energy and playfulness to the camera, even as it follows them, sometimes from the ground up. And I like I mentioned, reinforces the resilience of these young women, and that they can find joy and maintain a strong bond even in a situation with high stakes, So was it important to let the viewer observe the fact that these are still children, and children tend to find any experience of joy regardless of their societal circumstances?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. The idea of trying to capture we thought, okay, wouldn't it be great to try to have the film take place from the perspective of Anuja? And so I'm glad you noticed that a lot of the camera work is shot from kind of the ground or from a eye level lower than that of your average adult, right? And by the way, that makes filming in the streets of Delhi exceedingly complicated and difficult, because when you bring a camera down, that means everything in the background is in frame, including all the passerbys who might burn the lens.
I was going to say, how did you manage the crowds? Yeah.
It was just sheer stupidity. In retrospect, I would have abandoned doing it that way. And I went back. I watched this other film that was shot on the streets of I forget, but in a large city, and they shot from above, and that is the way to do it. That way, you don't have to worry about people. So it was just very difficult managing crowds in Delhi. We had at any given time, all the street shots, we had literally, I'm not exaggerating, 100
people looking at the camera.
200 people just gathered around, in a big mob of people, and oftentimes blocking traffic. And then you have and so it was very complicated and tedious. It was hard. And quite frankly, we had to cut a lot of shots because people would burn the lens. And then sometimes we go, well, could we use some VFX to fix that? And that's pretty challenging to do. And we have like zero budget, but it is true. We tried to capture everything from Anuja's standpoint as much as possible, including like the opening story, where what we're seeing is what Anuja is thinking as she's hearing the story, being told by her older sister.
The mongoose. Yeah.
Again, we slip into her perspective when Palak tells her about how she's, where she's getting the bags. Let's just say that. And so we kind of slip into Anuja's like imagination space whenever her sister starts to kind of, tell her a tale. And then, of course, you have that like in the opening scene where the factory owner and the social worker / teacher are having the conversation. Like you're seeing, you're seeing it exactly from Anuja's perspective, which is kind of, my way as a filmmaker, like telling the audience right from the beginning, like, hey, pay attention to how you're seeing this story unfold, because you are in fact legitimately seeing it just from her vantage point.
You came across Sajid Patan, who kind of portrays Anuja and is from the Salam Balak Trust. That must have been incredibly interesting to take somebody with the lived experience and then kind of shoot a film with them, especially when, you know, potentially some of the storylines that they're playing out could be, I don't know, I guess potentially triggering for them. But she does an incredible job, and the film kind of rests on her shoulders for the most part. Like, what is it like, you know, A, to direct children, and then B, to direct children who have had these lived experiences? And then I guess I also wanted to know as well, do you speak Hindi? Because I guess that's another element on top of it as well.
I spoke it. I thought it would come back to me more than it did during the shoot. Because you know, when I was living in India, I've been back a couple times since, but that was about over the course of a 5-6 year period, starting in like the late 90s into the early 2000s. That was when my Hindi was at its peak. So I knew, the kind of the medium-sized answer to that question is I could understand the screenplay because it was text that I had in front of me to work with, right? I worked with translators.
Sure.
And in fact, I worked with a translator who'd been working with a nonprofit in that space, so that she had an ear for the language, and then we had other people kind of take a pass. And so it was almost, by the time we were done with the final script, it had been kind of translated and retranslated so many times that into a vernacular. I don't think it's a vernacular that would be at all difficult for any Hindi speaker to understand at all. But we tried to capture as much as possible the Hindi that these kids would have spoken.
Yeah. Well, you didn't make it an easy process for yourself then.
No.
In terms of making the
film. We went everything that was difficult and seemingly impossible. We just decided, okay, let's do it that way. Because I'm stupid. Let's just go.
Well, it's paid off. It's paid off. But like, what is that like? Kind of directing children with those kind of lived experiences.
Well, you know, it's interesting. One thing that we didn't shoot. There was no way we could shoot linearly, or what's the word? Sequentially, right? So we shot everything out of sequence, and I still believe pretty strongly that Sazda didn't have an idea of really the full scope of the film, like the from beginning to end. It was almost like each day we're like, okay, here's what we're doing, and this is what the sisters will be doing. You know, so it was kind of like, I kind of felt like the story. By the way, the story was complete before we cast Sazda. The script was pretty much finished, with the exception of like working out some of the tweaks in the Hindi and trying to make that Hindi sound a little bit more right. But the story was already finished, and it's just a tremendous coincidence that Sazda happens to be a girl who was living on the streets with her older sister. And so it's just crazy that her own story does really parallel that of Anuja so closely. But at the same time, that did make us worry a bit. Like, is there going to be some sort? Because the other thing that has to be said is that Sazda is now no longer living with her sister, but she's now living in a home. You know, so that's again like kind of a crazy. Now they both live in Delhi and whatnot, but yeah. So it's so there's all kinds of weird things here that you know we were having to be, you know,
there's a responsibility. Yeah.
So we made sure that it was fun for her at all times, and for me, working with actors in general, I tend to think the more you can, the beauty about filmmaking is that yes, you have to have a script, and yes, you have to stay on the lines. Otherwise, you've got to stay true to the script is for me, it's like gospel, you know, or it's Veda. I would say like you have to stick with it word for word. But at the same time, if there's ever places in the script where there's flexibility, you try to create the conditions in which the actors can kind of give it whatever they've got and experiment and improvise. You know, every director knows you have to have a handle on it. Improvisation can go really wrong really fast. So you have to build the story in such a way as also to accommodate that. So there were a lot of scenes in this film that accommodated a great deal of improvisation. The two sisters in their little home where they're reading through the matrimonial ads, I had found those are actual matrimonial ads that they're reading. We didn't write those or make them up. Those are actual ads that people had placed in the paper. But we we gave them a bunch of them to read, and we gave them some ideas of some silly jokes they could play with. But ultimately, we let them riff on it, because that was a place where they could riff, and they're the fun that they could create by reading these ads, which are inherently funny, by the way. Like,
oh yeah,
kids read these things and they laugh because these are, some dude places an ad saying the kind of woman, he wants to marry, and some of them are actually quite offensive, and you don't know if they're just trying to be funny or and then some, and then others are completely obviously very sincere. My goal was not to rehearse. We do no rehearsals. All we do is we play games. We get the girls to kind of feel like they have a sisterly bond. So we spend about, I don't know exactly, I've lost track, but it was probably about 3 days in a small hotel where we were all staying together in advance of filming. Where the girls were, every day we were just like eating ice cream and playing games and doing like, not doing rehearsals, but doing like warm-ups and stuff. And by the end of those 3 days, those kids were it was like being at camp together. And so they were so bonded. That was one of the most essential things. And then just during the filming, we let Sazda, we let her experience kind of just unfold and come out. And the one example I keep turning back to because it makes the point so crystal clear and quickly is that when we shot the scene where there's a security, a shopkeeper who grabs her to retain her for the security guard, on the second take, she bit the guy's hand. And like totally out of the blue, like that's not in the script. Nobody prompted her to do it. She just did it. It just felt right to her. And I was like, yes, that's awesome. And so we used that take in the film, of course.
What was his reaction to that?
Very real. And that's the thing. Like, he dropped his line, actually. I can't remember exactly. He was on a line. Basically, he was more or less saying like, girls like this can't be in here. What are they doing? Whatever. And he's like, just like, and so he just, and it was great. And we
pure shock.
Well. And we haven't put it in the trailer, so it really, that was beautiful. And things like that happened all the time though. When she's running through the mall, again, all improvisation. We didn't tell her where to run. In fact, we couldn't because we were being chased ourselves by the real shopkeeper whose permission we thought we had, but apparently didn't. And so they were trying to kick us out of the mall as we were shooting this mall scene. So we had a fake security guard, an actor chasing Sazda, the actress, and then the cameraman, Akash, chasing them, and then a real security guard chasing Akash. And so Sazda looks really scared, when she's looking, she's like turning, like, where the hell do I go? And that's actually very real. She really is like, where the hell do I go? She didn't know where to run.
She's probably looking at you guys thinking like you guys look panicked.
Yeah.
Mirroring you guys.
Yeah. So that's my general sense is you just got to let your actors, give them as much slack as you possibly can to play with, to move with.
I think it definitely paid off in terms of the connection between the sisters, because the ending of the film kind of leaves you on a note of like, this could go either way. And I think you do a good job in the film of kind of showing why working in these factories, there is kind of a draw to it, like I imagine most of us, like kind of maybe Western modern audiences are looking at the ending and going, she should go to school and that her prospects are going to be better, and that's the way to do it. But there is also a part of you that's just like, well, she stays with her sister, they've got this great bond, they are making money, like I know they're being taken advantage of, but like there's something there, and I think you kind of get that draw correctly. Was that something that you intended? You wanted to show like why this kind of lifestyle, gets children in the first place?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it is exactly the case that I didn't want to trivialize the decision that that far too many kids have to make, because it really is, or kids and their families, right? I wanted to make sure it's so easy, like you said, for us, I don't know your guys' backgrounds, but, just looking at you, like, we live pretty privileged lifestyles. We, living in wealthy countries or whatever. And we have options. So it's very easy for us to take a kind of condescending Western elite, wealthy view of these kids and like, well, of course, this, girl should go to school. Of course, that's the smart choice. But it can, in some cases feel like abandoning your family responsibilities, abandoning your ability to contribute to your your family's well-being. And when you're placed in a situation where your material needs are not being met, when you live in dire, abject poverty, it changes everything, right? And so it isn't an easy choice for these families to make. And when nonprofits like the Slambolic Trust or Save the Children, when they go into these communities and talk to families about letting their daughters attend school, it's not because it's not like these parents don't love their daughters, it's not that they think they're doing the best by their children as well, so it is a hard choice, and I wanted to try to bring the audience as quickly as possible within the scope of that 22-minute period to that existential moment of decision, and to make it an existential crisis for the audience as much as the kids. So so I wanted to make that, I wanted to raise the stakes and make it as difficult as possible for Anuja to just say, yeah, let's do this,
Well, and also, I think that ending's really, the stakes are raised and the ambiguity is so important, because you're not absolving the watcher at the end. You're going, oh, it's okay. Everybody, both sisters had a happy outcome here. I mean, there is the possibility of that in the future, but, it stops us from going out the door and not thinking about the film anymore, which is really important. And one of the things that really stuck with me, Adam, is the relationship between adults in this film. And what you were saying earlier on about, yes, they don't overly exist as much as they do in this factory setting, and it's now kind of integrated into these home environments, and it's harder to track. And it's just so interesting to follow Anuja, where perhaps I felt initially that she was conflicted out of fear for Mr. Verma, the factory owner. He completely wants to obviously exploit her gifts and hinder her own progression in order to feed his own selfish goals. And then the film transitions and gets us to that ending where the inner conflict was actually, it came mainly from the bond that she shared with her sister, and not wanting to face the potential outcome of leaving her behind. So the intensity of that decision to stay or go really comes to the ending of that film. And it's also just so unfair watching the film that, we're observing a world in which a young girl like Anuja has to make decisions like this. The literal weight of the world is on her shoulders. And if girls like Anuja have to, make decisions like that, it's so detrimental. She literally, if she chooses to go to school, she leaves her sister behind, but if she stays with her sister, then she might not ever get that opportunity ever again. And it's just a real cruel reality, and that's where the intensity comes from, obviously. So, was it important to you, I guess, a long way of saying it, to not only depict the lives of these young women, but also explore the impact that adults have in their environments to have a shape on their futures?
Yes. Very nice. Again, nicely put. You guys speak more eloquently about this film than I do. I should be better
practiced. Not at all, Adam.
What you've said is amazing. I think you're exactly right. I think I didn't want to create cartoonish adult characters. Like, I think it's the case that Verma, the factory owner, comes across, quite malicious. At the same time, I tried to write the screenplay in such a way, the opening dialogue between him and the teacher, social worker, in such a way as you can understand how he could at least conceive of himself as being the hero of his own, in this world. There's like an underlying issue of caste and class associated with the relationship.
Yeah, he makes that clear.
Yeah. And so he's like, he tells himself, Verma tells himself that if Anuja goes off to some elite private boarding school, she's just going to be treated as badly as Mr. Mishra, the social worker, treats Verma, the factory. And so he, in his mind, he thinks that he's actually providing Anuja with the best opportunity, and that, in that someone like Mishra, the teacher, just looks down his nose at both of them, really, ultimately. And so I wanted there to be some degree of complexity there, so it wasn't just obvious that Verma's bad, Mr. Mishra good.
No, he's quite charming, I thought, as well. There's like a protective charm to him, I think when he gives the ultimatum in one of his final scenes to Anuja, like, either do this or you're not, or neither of you are having any work. I was like, oh man, you've let yourself down.
Yeah. He's gone too far.
There's also like a realization whenever he's looking at the clock and it's like 5 to 8 and he realizes that Anuja's not going to be coming. That he almost kind of like looks down and sort of thinks to himself, "Oh, fair play." There's a little bit of that recognition too.
Yeah. He's incredible. I mean, Nagesh Bosley, he's just an incredible actor. By the way, he was just a friend of a friend. I didn't cast him. I just called him up and I was like, "Wow, dude." We've got a common friend, and you're amazing. You are this character. Like, let's get you on, And he's like, yes. And he just like, tell me where you want me. He just like, tell me where. Tell me where. I mean, he didn't want to get. He just wanted to show up. He lives in Mumbai. He's been in movies like Hotel Mumbai, acting alongside Dave Patel. And,
wow.
That's his. For Western audiences, that will be his best known film. He was actually cast in Dave Patel's Monkey Man, but that whole scene was ultimately cut, or that whole scenario was cut from that film, I believe. And but he's incredible. He's just like, wow, yeah, let's do this. Tell me when I need to be, where I need to be, and I'll be there. So he just showed up and just knocked it out of the park. He's so charismatic and complex, But yeah, so those adult characters, though, the relationship between those are important. And I also just wanted to add that there's like a fifth character who doesn't appear in the film, and that is this Mr. Adams, who's clearly me in some sense, right? And I guess what I was trying to do there was I wanted to make it. I know this is subtle and it's not obvious. It's kind of like just like a gesture, it's like almost like an Easter egg. But I think it's important to note that child labor is not like a problem that's out there. First off, it exists in every country. It exists in the UK. It exists in America. It exists right here in Los Angeles. It's not an India problem. But also, it's a problem that we're all to some extent implicated in and complicit in. I mean, we're complicit in this kind of global economic system that does require doesn't require, but it does largely rest upon the exploitation of cheap labor and oftentimes child labor. And so, every time we're out there trying to, purchase a cheap piece of article of clothing, like, well, how do you make a pair of jeans for $10? Well, this is, partly the answer to that story. Although I will say that also sometimes expensive brands also, engage in child labor. But my point is that it's a global problem. It's part of a global economy. And so Verma is himself, in some sense, a victim vis-a-vis this exporter is how in studying the kind of the fashion industry and how it works, I conceive of this person as being an exporter, someone who's working as a middleman with larger brands and is kind of basically farming out jobs to different factories. Verma has a lot of pressure being placed on him to execute an order and try to get this order done by a certain time, right? And it's that need to execute the order that forces him to ultimately exploit children in the process of making the product. And so I was trying to implicate another adult, which is us, the audience, without like wagging a finger and being, no, I'm not trying to be like, moralistic about it. Just kind of nodding, just kind of tipping the hat, or how can I put this? Just pulling the mask back a little bit so we see ourselves in this film too.
Yeah. So in the seed of thought, yeah, 100%. Yeah, and I will reiterate what you said. I don't think that the film ever feels like it's wagging its finger at you. I think if you came into the film and somebody just put it on for you, I think you would be actually quite surprised by whenever the credits come up and you see that it is, that it's funded in its way and its objective is ultimately placed within a charity organization. So it comes across that way for sure,
and it works really well putting that at the end as well. I think
it
hits home the point, and you're like,
100%.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will say that the Slumbog Trust didn't fund it happily. We would never take a dime from that organization. They're doing work that's far more important than making a movie on a daily basis. But they did. They were incredibly generous and with their time and accommodating with their expertise. And so, so that's why we figured they're like producing partners, and we do think that there's an opportunity here to kind of use the film as a way to kind of shine a light on all the great work that they're doing.
Well, that probably leads us in well to kind of talk about the film now, like post production in its festival run. Are you in the middle of the festival run right now, or is it? Are you at the end?
We really are in the middle. We premiered at a festival in, I believe it was late June. And so June, July, August, September, October. Yeah. So we've only, we haven't done a full year, so we're pretty much in the middle. However, that said, I will say the last couple months, or the last month at least, we've been kind of focusing on this Oscar campaign piece. And that's kind of been a lot of our attention has been focused on a lot of, I don't like film promotion, it's not there are people who are really good at it and I'm not. So I don't like things that I'm not good at. But
it must be nice to have that buzz, because I imagine you don't go into these projects thinking like, oh, you never know, I might get shortlisted for the Oscars, I'm nominated for the Oscar. But you've got Variety, I believe, put you down as a potential prediction as a Oscar nominee.
Yeah,
that must feel pretty cool.
A shocker. That really felt good. Yeah, that was a real shocker to us, and that was, and I have to say, like, in some sense, I'm obviously incredibly grateful, but like, what a curse that is, because then all of a sudden you feel this pressure, like, wow, now we got to do everything we possibly can to make that true, because
that's more people seeing the film, that's the most important thing, right?
Yeah, getting people to watch the film is definitely the most important thing, and the sad truth is, though, right now it really is only, it's publicly available it's not publicly available, it's available on the Academy streaming service, right? So if you're like a voting Academy member, you go watch it right now. But in terms of catching it at a festival or whatnot, like we anticipate that there'll be like, we have other festivals coming up. I don't have the list in front of me, but
I don't believe you've been to the UK yet. Am I right in thinking?
No, we just actually, sadly, we just screened 2 nights ago at Holly Shorts London.
Did you? Brilliant.
What's it called? There's a theater. I don't know where. Sadly, I couldn't make it. I just don't have the resources to get there. But one of our filmmakers was, and in fact, our cinematographer won best cinematography at there. So we're really happy about that.
Oh, brilliant.
Holly Shorts, we won their best short
live action.
Thank you. at their main festival here in Hollywood, however many months ago now. So to be given yet another little accolade there is really special. It's really nice. And our DP Akash Rajay, young, extremely talented guy, doing really great work. This was, I think, probably his first or second film out of grad school. Really deserved the award for his cinematography, which is, I think, really, amazing, right, considering the limited resources that we had and the intense circumstances under which we shot the film.
Which I guess he's done a very good job, because it doesn't feel that way. It feels effortless when you're watching the film. The other kind of thing that's happened recently as well that I wanted to kind of discuss was you've had Mindy Kaling join as a producer on the film, which I guess is like fantastic news to get more eyes on the project at this time. I was just kind of like interested in that whole process. I just kind of curious, like, how does the producer in this kind of context work as somebody who boards the film after production? Is this to try and get as many people to watch the story as possible?
100%. Yeah. What we don't see, because we're such a the team is basically myself, my wife, one of my other producers who's an editor who's South Asian but living in Los Angeles right now. My brother was involved in helping fund the filming of the film and was on set for for much of the film, and he's a producer. But we're like outsiders in this field, in this industry, and so from the beginning we knew we would have to attract partners who knew how to navigate. And the one of the roles of producer plays is that navigating the kind of the industry and trying to figure out, like, okay, what are the sources of distribution? Where can we get this film out into the world? Eventually we want to make sure that it is publicly available, and like, having it maybe on a streamer or a streaming platform would be like probably the dream for us. And I think that, someone like Mindy, I mean, she's a pro. I mean, she's a pro producer and on top of being a pro writer and an actress and screenwriter, of course. So I think she comes on board. It's a really small world story. She knew my wife's work. My wife's an artist, and so she followed my wife's Instagram page. And at one point, they had DM'd each other about something. I think Mindy was thinking about maybe buying a work of art from my wife, and then they kind of were going back and forth. And then my wife was like, "Hey, by the way, I just my husband and I just made this film. Would you take a look at it?" And she gets hit with just scores of like unsolicited submissions. And so I have to admit, it was a beautiful that we got her to watch it, and that she was able to watch it, and that she just immediately, the performance of these two young girls just immediately resonated with her, as it does, as they do, I think, with every audience. You can't not be completely struck by these gifted young actresses who are the heart and soul of the film, and so we knew that if she watched it, she'd like it, and we're just happy that she liked it so much. So so she's come on board, really, is kind of like basically helping us figure out how to package the whole thing in not in the technical film sense of like a track, package means something else oftentimes in producing, but just try to kind of create conversations with people in the industry about how the film can be programmed, I guess. And I will say this also, like in this whole, it's a weird thing, but like the whole Oscar, race is oftentimes, how can I put this? It's the whole like celebrity EP thing plays a big role in, because all these scrappy little projects that are largely self-funded on people's, people just put it on the credit card and go into debt making their short films. They don't have anything left over for the promotion really side. So if you can get somebody to, with a name to attach themselves to the film, that immediately gets you some, coverage, right? And some,
of course,
earned press, as you might call it. And that's really important when you're trying to make sure that a film that you've poured all your family resources into gets seen. Not talking about my own.
What happens then for yourself at the end of this kind of festival run? You mentioned you'd like to kind of transition into features. Are you working on anything at the moment? Have you got another short story in mind? Do you want to expand Anuja potentially? Like what's
potentially. I have a couple. Yeah. I have 3 different scripts in 3 different genres, very different. Each one moves in a very different direction. And I do have one. So we're talking about Anuja. I do have one that I'm really excited about that I've been mulling over. It's not completed, but I have it's in each one of these scripts is in a different kind of state of completion. But I do have one that does pick up on Anuja. It's not an expanded version of Anuja, but rather it takes the Anuja character, like a character living in very similar circumstances, and situates her within a broader plot with other moving pieces. It's almost like an international thriller. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the movie. Like take Alejandro Iñárritu's Babel, for example. And if you remember Babel with like Brad Pitt and Cate Blanchett, and there's kind of takes place on 3 different continents. Another movie that it's maybe similar to, but maybe a little bit less political, is Syriana, which stars Matt Damon and George Clooney. I don't know anyways, but so it's kind of a international thriller drama. And
you don't like to do things easy, Adam, do you?
yeah. It's just a low budget. It takes place on 3 different continents. It's going to be easy. I'm going to film it over the course of 2 weekends.
Yeah.
No, you're right. It is an ambitious project. But I actually do think I could make it.
So will Sadia be returning?
Would love to have her return. She's we filmed. We were doing the math on this. We wrapped production over 2 years ago. By the time I get my feature off the ground, Sazda will be a young adult. She'll no longer be a little child. And so I would love to have her in anything I do in the future. It doesn't have to be, by the way, she's studying in addition to math and reading and writing all the core disciplines. She's also studying a bit of English here and there. I'll put her in anything. And Anya too. I mean, they're just such great actresses.
No, I don't blame you.
So she may not play that particular role, but I'll find a role for her. I'll write her into the script. She'll be there.
That's incredible.
Sure. Maybe the older sister. But yeah, it's a story about that screenplay though is a story about two kids who work basically work as rag pickers at an e-waste facility in Salimpur, which is the largest e-waste facility in the world. That's where like all of our laptops and hard drives and cell phones wind up. They don't always go into dumpsters outside of London. Oftentimes they wind up in dumping grounds in far off lands. We export our trash, in other words, and electronic components are highly toxic and pose all kinds of public health risks. And unfortunately, our waste winds up being other people's problems. And there are kids who pick through the dumps where our old cell phones and laptops are sitting in search of precious metals and materials that can be salvaged and resold. And in some cases, they find a device that's still functioning. And so that this film kind of takes off from there. You can kind of take a guess at where that goes. But anyway, so it's that's the story that I'm working on now.
Sounds good.
That sounds exciting.
Does, definitely. On the podcast, we've been working through our blind spots on the Sight and Sound greatest films of all time list. So on that list, we found that like a lot of the films that we're watching are favorites of filmmakers and critics, and you can see from watching these like how they've influenced modern day films and how they've influenced the filmmakers who are kind of curating the list themselves. So I was wondering, like, what are some of your favorite films that have influenced your filmmaking style or the stories that you wish to tell in the future or now or in the future?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. I'm going to go with the films of the Dardenne brothers. These two, are you familiar with the Dardenne brothers? They're Belgian filmmakers. They're two brothers who were documentarians in the 1980s and in the early 90s started to write, basically using their documentary style. They started to film narrative, like live action films. And they're very, like, they're celebrated in the French speaking world, but their films don't get huge distribution outside of that. But one of my favorites of theirs is called The Promise. La Promesse, I guess. La Promesse. Sorry, my French is. I haven't been speaking French in a while. And beautiful film. They use non-professional actors for the most part. They shoot around their small town in Belgium, and it's about a family, a poor father-son family that is engaged in human trafficking, basically smuggling immigrants into their country, and they exploit them and they take advantage. It's a film that sounds really tough, and it is. This is tough. It's not quite the kind of fairy tale that Anuja can be. It doesn't draw on fable and myth and storytelling in that sense. It's a bit more gritty and rough and raw, but it's beautiful filmmaking, and it's not just an important social issue, but it's just a human story of like universal import, fundamentally about the relationship between a father and his son. And that's what I love. I think that's, for me, the key. Is like Anuja is ultimately, yes, it's about child labor, but really it's just about the love between siblings.
Yeah.
And I think the La Promesse is a film that is also like about the relationship between a father and his son, and the moment that the son realizes that the father is maybe not the man he always thought he was, that sort of thing. But it couches that family drama within the context of an important social issue that is oftentimes not seen. And so I would point to that. Then there are all kinds of other examples that people have given you before. Like one of my favorite personalities in the world of film is Orson Welles. Big surprise there, as if his films don't make the list, right? Of course they do. But the film that people don't generally, although there's one scene from it, it's actually the worst scene in the film. The film that people don't generally take as serious as they should is The Lady from Shanghai. Gorgeous, beautiful, fascinating, dark, twisted noir that that's only known for the House of Mirrors scene, which is fine. It's, it's reference. There's like an homage in a Woody Allen. There's a lot of homages to that scene. But the rest of the film is better than that scene. And so I think people should go back and rewatch that.
We recently covered The Third Man. Yeah.
You're right. And Wells claims to have written his lines in that film, the little bit about the cuckoo clock. Anyways,
yeah.
And didn't write the screenplay, but claims to have written the lines. And it's a great film. Another one important fact about that film is it was shot on location in Vienna right after the war, which is pretty remarkable. Not a lot of films were being shot in that way in the studio days, and to shoot right there on location so close. Yeah, it's it does give it verite is the wrong word, but it gives it a texture that feels very contemporary, I think.
There's like an atmosphere, isn't there?
Yeah, compared to like say Casablanca. I don't think they're similar movies really, but there is obviously some kind of loose analogy between the two. But, you see Casablanca, it's beautiful set pieces, no doubt about it. But
yeah, a lot more romantic.
It ain't filmed in Casablanca. And that's pretty clear, that place looks, more like anyway. So, although now you can go to Casablanca and there's a place called Rick's Cafe. And
right. Does he play You Must Remember This on repeat? Yeah.
Did I answer the question?
Definitely. And I think, especially that first documentary, I'm adding that to the watch list. Very intrigued by that. So thank you for sharing those.
Good one.
And I guess that brings us to the end of the interview. So Adam, thank you so much.
Alex, Chris, thank you guys. This was a really penetrating discussion. You guys do a great job. Really get deep into this stuff. So I appreciate the time that you gave me, and I hope. I hope I didn't bore your listeners.
Definitely not.
Not at all.
Sure you did not. No, it was great to get insight onto the film, and if it screens again in the UK, we'll make sure to promote that. But when it's publicly available, we'll share as well. But thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Of course, thank you, Adam.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Well, there you go, Chris. That was our interview with Adam J. Graves and his short film, Anuja. As mentioned at the top of the episode, not publicly available yet. Unless it is, a few months down the line and you're listening to this, we'll update the show notes. So worth just checking the show notes just in case. And you never know, by this time, it might have been nominated for an Oscar, for all we know.
Exactly. And if it's getting all that traction, then there's pretty high possibility that a streaming network may pick it up and play in one that's local to you, or you can watch on your TV. So yeah, watch this space. It's definitely worth checking out. And it's just really great to have somebody like Adam on the show who really absolutely exerts the passion that he has for the project and in a very authentic way. You can tell that this means a lot to him and his team behind the project. And yeah, I think as many people as possible need to see a film like this.
Yeah. And it's interesting as well to hear a slightly different trajectory of somebody kind of falling in love with filmmaking. Like for Adam here, what an interesting kind of background of philosophy and South Asian studies to then go on to create short films and obviously hope to transition into feature filmmaking. I thought it was really interesting and to kind of get, the reasons as to why he's creating these stories and working with his producing partner, that is his wife, and kind of the stories they want to tell, and raise awareness as well. Is very interesting. I thought it was a great conversation. Yeah. Really enjoyed talking to Adam. Lovely guy. And we hope you enjoyed the interview too. And if you did, go tell people about it. Go tell people about the podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, everything really does help. If you leave a comment or like us, well, we like you.
All right. Well, join us next week. I think we're going to have a little bit of a looser episode where we catch up with some of the kind of films that we've been trying, this time of year, full throttle trying to catch up with everything before your year-end list. You know how it is when you're doing reviews, when you're on Letterboxd, when you have an output or an outlet for films, you want to get your top 10 right. So I think we're going to have a little bit more of a looser episode, and that will probably be our last episode of this year.
Oh, that's sad.
It is.
I'm going to tell you, Alex, I am behind. I am so behind. Excited to catch up with a lot of films and just hope that I actually do them. I actually do my homework.
Well, there's no pressure. There's no pressure on what film you watch for next week, Chris. Let's just talk about what we've been watching over the last few weeks. If it's one or two films, it's one or two films.
Mm-hmm. No Santa's Sleigh, though, this year for people who listened to last year's podcast.
Absolutely. Who knows, though? We might catch up with Red One.
In IMAX, of course.
The only way to watch it. Brilliant. Well, that has been the episode for this week. If you've enjoyed it, make sure to leave us a 5-star rating or review. We do really appreciate it. And if you'd like to keep up to date with us, make sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at The Film Angle.
We also have a Film Angle playlist. If you want to listen to what we listen to, you can find that in the show notes. Be sure to catch us next week for more cinematic discussions. But goodbye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.